Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens with mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined by Terri Givens, who is a professor of political science at McGill University and the author of The Roots of Racism, The Politics of White Supremacy in the US and Europe. Thanks for joining us, Terri.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I guess just to begin with, what was the impetus for writing The Roots of Racism?
Well, really, it's a compilation of the research I've been doing since the late 1990s on the radical right and anti-immigrant politics. And, really one of the things I've come to realize over the last few, really 5 years or so is that we're seeing this conflation of immigration and racism, so that immigrants are, regardless of their background, are facing similar types of racism that we've seen throughout history. And one of the things that I really wanted to do is make sure that we had a touchstone from a historical perspective of, why are we seeing the same kinds of attitudes and even, the rise of anti-immigrant far-right parties on both sides of the Atlantic. And of course, I know it goes beyond that, but really my focus was, the fact that we have these 400 years of history around racism and slavery and so on that are really interconnected.
Some might characterize the book as being critical of things, perhaps presenting some theory about race, which is a topic that has come in for some discussion in the United States and elsewhere lately. Could you contextualize historically the current moral panic amongst conservatives about critical race theory?
Absolutely. I mean, I would call it abject fear. And, they're in a completely defensive position at this point because what they're realizing is that as the United States and, and other countries, as similar trends are happening, become more diverse and people are, really, in many ways, Obama epitomizes what, their greatest fear. You have a black president who comes in and frankly, Obama was very moderate for, even for a Democrat in the United States. He was very careful about how he pursued his policies and so on. And so realistically, he wasn't the extremist that people claimed he was. So, to put it in the broader context, though, that we've had this long history in the U.S., and of course, it's very much linked with Europe around immigration restrictions and trying to keep these countries basically fairly homogenous. And of course, in the 1960s, that shifted in the U.S. and Canada. And in Europe, you saw the increasing flows of migrant guest workers who were coming from places like Algeria and Southern Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East and so on. And so you saw this increase in people of Muslim background. And so the panic amongst conservatives is that they're losing power. And they're losing power to a minority that is growing faster in terms of, just numbers and is having an impact on their ability to govern.
In the book, you discuss the concept of comparative race theory as opposed to critical race theory. Could you tell us what that is and how they differ?
So the difference, so what I realized is I was looking very closely at critical race theory. And, the problem with it's not a problem, I should say. It's just what I saw and really what I've been railing against in political science for pretty much my entire career is that we can't keep things confined within borders, right? The United States is just one country of many that is grappling with a growing diverse population. And so comparative race theory is an approach that allows us to look beyond U.S. borders and say, okay, how are these similar trends are, and really it's a hypothesis. We need to do this analysis. Is it similar in Canada? Is it similar in the UK? Is it similar in France? And, all along throughout my career, people, well, you can't study this in France because there's no racism in France. Well, we know that's not true, at least those of us who study this. And so it's really pushing, and as you know, I started off the book really pushing political science to say this is not just an American issue. First of all, we have to acknowledge that racism is an issue. And then we have to acknowledge that it's not just a U.S. issue. And I can tell you right now, living in Montreal, it's not just a U.S. issue. It's not just a European issue, really. But there are things that connect us throughout history, including the history of slavery and the way that our colonial ties have impacted things like immigration that we really need to grapple with. And I'm really pushing political science and, frankly, other disciplines to grapple more with the broader context of immigration and colonialism and neocolonialism and how it's impacting the flows of people and impacting people's reaction to those flows.
Terri, in particular, why do you think that the discipline of political science has struggled so much with the concept of racism?
Because there haven't been enough of people like me, and I'm African American, studying these things. I mean, realistically, that's a huge part of it, is that we have a discipline that until the early 2000s wasn't even looking at very closely, voting behavior from a more diverse perspective. Everything, we initially got to, okay, well, let's look at Black and white voters. Well, it's only been, say, in the last 10, 15 years that we've really looked closely at even Hispanic voters or, Asian voters. I have a good friend who's been working on a project to actually, look at Asian American and Pacific Islander voters. And so our discipline itself had to diversify in order for these issues to be really put front and center.
And can you explain the impact that the movements for racial equality and Black civil rights have had on the development of political science? Has that been allow for an opening for the kinds of research you'd like to conduct?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's taken time. I remember a couple of my colleagues from University of Michigan, Vince Hutchings and Nick Valentino, wrote an interesting article back in the early 2000s about kind of these developments in the study of really focusing more on survey data. But, it's interesting how, if you really look at the historical issues, and actually I have to mention Jessica Blatt's book about immigration, political science and race. And, she goes back to the early 20th century and examines how political science really, there was an initial interesting kind of focus on race that was really more connected to the scientific racism and eugenicists and so on. And then there was just a complete, utter and actually I have to give, some other folks credit, Bob Vitalis and others who really dug into that origin story of political science and how it initially did really focus on race, but from a more, scientific racism perspective. And then race just disappeared as an issue for about 50 years. And then it comes back during the civil rights movement. And so the civil rights movement was really critical in opening up the door again to a more critical focus on race. And of course, you have the development later on of critical race theory that very deeply impacted political science. But there's, lots of folks who were, basically trying to open that door for a while. And the problem is it was really on the fringes. And it still is to a certain extent. I mean, I remember back when I was, in my early years as a political scientist in the late 90s, early 2000s, being told that, that's just, these are fringe topics and, they don't belong in the American Political Science Review, our main journal and things like that. And so it's taken, and to this day, I think that there are a lot of senior scholars who think that things like studying the issues of race are distractions or on the sidelines. And I'm trying to, basically drag these issues to the center and really help people to understand how it impacts everything. So I'm watching the local politics in Montreal and Quebec, and it's, you can see it there, and it's very plain and clear. I mean, it's not like it's hidden. So these issues really if we don't look at politics from a perspective of how they're impacted by racism and the long history, even here in Canada, of Indigenous suppression and oppression, then you're not going to understand why you're getting the outcomes you're getting.
Could you speak to how and why things like the Holocaust pose particular problems for the study of race by political scientists in Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, of course, people will argue that because race was front and center in the Holocaust, and the fact that people were being identified as Jews, and not just Jews were killed during the Holocaust. Obviously, we know there's many other groups were part of that. So that pushes back against this idea of, doing a census. So I know in Germany, the census and in France, the census was very controversial because of that history. And so it made it very difficult even to this day, to even track, how many people, how many Black people are there in Germany or in France, because we don't have that data. And so, there's a lot of, again, I refer to some of my colleagues in this field, particularly in France, who have really tried to find ways to, in France, it's actually within their constitution that, you can't, define people by race. And so, and as we know, I want to make sure I make it very clear that race is a social construct, not a scientific or physical or construct. It's we know that basically all humans are the same once you get down into the level of chromosomes and DNA. But the social construct creates a situation where people who have a particular phenotype are treated differently. And that's, the data is very clear on that. But I want to make it clear that that does not mean that race is a real thing. Race is something that is a social construct that is utilized to basically put people into certain categories. And so that whole history of the Holocaust is clearly something that, has created a situation where people don't want to, use data, but that data is critical for doing things like proving systemic discrimination. So it's a bit of a conundrum, and there's a lot of people who are working to try and figure out ways to get around that.
And exploring the roots of racism, Terri, your book examines several centuries of history, and you consider how racism is linked to colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. Could you elaborate a little on that relationship?
So we know that, actually I was recently in Portugal and was reminded of the fact that, the Portuguese were responsible for, taking about 4 million Africans from Africa to the New World, both across the U.S. and the Caribbean and South Latin America. So, particularly Brazil. And so, the connections, those historical connections are important because there are relationships that still persist that go back to that time period. And that includes the fact that, there's still, basically you have Brazil that's, has a large population of African descent, and that, they are treated differently depending on their skin tone and things like that. And of course, in the U.S., we have that long history of the slave trade that led to, basically people from Africa in, dire circumstances. And even after the Civil War, basically we had a short period of Reconstruction, and then an ongoing campaign that included the Jim Crow laws to this day, mass incarceration that still impact people from these particular groups disparately. And that disparate impact is something we have to pay attention to and look at the connections historically. It's not enough to just say, well, that happened 400 years ago or 200 years ago. We have to understand that the effects of those things are still being felt to this day. And so I can see it when I go to Portugal and I see the African immigrants and people of African descent who've come there because they happen to speak Portuguese. And so there's so many ways that those connections are still very much in play. And you have Algerians in France because of that colonial history, right? It's not just because Algerians like France. So those colonial histories are very much intertwined with how those people got to where they are and how they're being treated today.
And how do you think race and racialization have changed following the end of chattel slavery in the 1800s?
Well, basically, there was different approaches to dealing with these in the U.S., of course, you had a very large population of people of African descent. And as I mentioned, there was the Reconstruction period. And then, there was a period of terror, frankly, where those in the South were terrorized by organizations like the Ku Klux Klan to be kept in their place, to be incarcerated, to be forced to work when they were incarcerated. And so many left. You had the Great Migration in the U.S., where so many left to go from the South to the North, including my own family members. I had a grandfather who left Georgia to go to Pittsburgh, and my mother left Louisiana to go to Los Angeles to find work and so on. And many of those people left because they were, it was, partly, and I highly, highly recommend the book by Isabel Wilkerson, The Warmth of Other Suns, because it really explains how people were, trying to leave a very difficult situation, which had, at the end of slavery, after Reconstruction, the Jim Crow laws and the inability to even send their children. My mother only had an 8th grade education because she wasn't allowed to go. She had to go to work. She couldn't go to high school. And yet my father, who was up in Pittsburgh, went on to high school and joined the military, and he and my mother met in Los Angeles. I mean, that's my personal story. But, you can't escape all those connections and linkages that have impacted people. And, I go to Europe and look at particularly the colonial period. And, there's a direct line between the colonial period in sub-Saharan Africa and Algeria in particular that led to people going to France. And then those people are discriminated against in terms of jobs and where they live. I mean, we have very stark residential segregation in France. And, these are, that they were raised as children to believe, well, I'm French. And so therefore, liberté, égalité, fraternité. But then they get older and realize, I can't get a job. I'm harassed by the police. And what does it really mean to be French? And so you see these things playing out in so many different ways.
The costs of racism have been dreadful, but I guess who do you think benefits from racism? What's the relationship between these racialized practices and other forms of social power, do you think?
Well, it's interesting. I refer to The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. There's a whole economic theory that's developing around these ideas, because what we're seeing, so it's a lot. It revolves a lot around political power, and not so much economic power. Although political power and economic power go together. And so the beneficiaries of it are clearly people who feel like they want to maintain a more homogenous society. And that's, I think, why you're seeing this panic amongst conservatives. And, and obviously, I have to specify it's mostly white conservatives, not all, but mostly white conservatives. So basically you have a situation. So I love the swimming pool example where, in the 1960s, when swimming pools, the federal government says you have to desegregate your swimming pools. Well, rather than actually desegregate, they filled the pools in. They shut down school systems. Is that in their economic benefit? No, but it is in their benefit in terms of wanting to maintain, a pure, group that wasn't going to be tainted by, we don't want to swim, with these Black people or brown people or whoever. And so it's very hard often to find a strong economic rationale for some of the behavior, and particularly if you read the book Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan Metzl. If you think about the fact that we had hundreds of thousands of people in the United States who were willing to listen to a leader at the time who was telling them, not to get vaccinated and don't believe this stuff, and many who died. And because they just held on to this belief. So a lot of this, what's driving this is this beliefs of white supremacy, of this idea that you can't trust these people who aren't, with us. I'm doing air quotes with my hands. And, this just hanging on to these beliefs that are literally killing people. And it's not killing, the people they want to be killed. I mean, there's a quote that I have in my book from a woman, Trump was supposed to hurt them, not us. And so it's hard to find a strong economic rationale for these behaviors. It has more to do with maintaining political power. You look at everything from the gerrymandering and the trying to keep people of color from voting. They've carved up districts and states just to make sure that people can't vote. Now, I can't say that's happening in Europe. It's not. But what's happening instead is, we have broader party systems where you have, these far right parties that are on the rise. And the fact that, for example, the Rassemblement in France, so led by Marine Le Pen is doing so well, and the AfD in Germany, although it's really interesting to look at the rise of the Greens as well. It's really upsetting the entire political system. I'm in the process of writing an article or just kind of a commentary on what's happened to the right in Europe. But you can't talk about what's happening to the right without looking at the disappearance of the left. Not completely. They're in power in Germany, but the Parti Socialiste has just been devastating France, and the Communist Party has practically disappeared. And so there's these different dynamics that are happening. In the U.S., you're seeing the Republican Party, we just had the speech by President Biden, who is talking about, authoritarianism and fascism on the rise in the Republican Party. And, we're seeing it in various ways. And obviously I don't think it's the vast majority, but certainly enough to be pushing that particular party in the direction of basically trying to keep people from voting and saying, your vote doesn't count, and that these elections are frauds because we didn't get the outcome we wanted. So that's where you're seeing these, and then frankly, to me, it's very, it's irrational, but it's this desire to maintain a system of power that has been in place for hundreds of years.
Terri, could you speak to the difference between white supremacy and white nationalism?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. It's so funny because I had that discussion with my publisher because they were asking, well, should it say white supremacy on the cover or white nationalism? So the reason I stuck with white supremacy, and I actually referenced some articles on that in the book, is that white nationalism to me is this desire, and to a lot of those of us who study this, is the desire to create a white state. That's what you had, for example, in South Africa. White supremacy is a bigger system. That is very tied into capitalism. And I should have mentioned that, when you're asking the question earlier about the economics, because this is all, white supremacy is very much tied into capitalism in the sense that if you look at the inequality that has been on the rise in the U.S. and Europe and across the board pretty much, that has a lot to do with the linkages to white supremacy in the sense that the laws and the tax policies and who gets bailouts, who gets loans, all these things, who gets venture capital. I lived in Silicon Valley for a long time. The people who are getting it, it's all part of a system of basically, I consider Silicon Valley, it's just, one white guy giving money to his friends' kids so they can start a company. Basically it's horrendous when you look at the numbers. I think 3% of venture capital goes to women, so it's a sexist thing as well. But also, 0.03% of all venture capital goes to Black women, and to Black people overall. I think it's like 1%. The percentages of this huge amount of wealth that's being tossed around in the venture capital world is going to all white males. And if you look at the Fortune 500, all these things, you can see that all the concentration of wealth is very much, in the white side of the ledger. And, we can point to a few, Black billionaires, but they, just in terms of the transfer of wealth, generational wealth, again, some of us, Heather McGhee gets into a lot of this, it's just been very difficult for African Americans in the U.S. And even if you look at immigrants and people of color in Europe to be able to build up any wealth.
The book ranges across a range of different territories, and you're at pains to develop a comparative study. Yeah. I did notice that Australia, or the Australian example, is referenced in the book, especially in terms of articulating how race and racism operates on a global level. Can you say a little bit about the global colour line, how that's developed and how it manifests in the 21st century?
Right. Yeah. And I think at some point I'm going to have to elaborate on that because it really pulls in the, kind of international relations side of it. And I really recommend Robert Vitalis, also known as Bob Vitalis, because he's a good friend. His work has really looked at this, kind of from a historical perspective very closely. And, you think about places like Australia that were colonies, but then also it's funny because Australia and Canada, of course, have so much in common in the sense that, they were colonies, people came and, the indigenous were pushed to the side and in many sense, in a sense of genocide in many ways. And from not just from the colonialization itself, but from disease, various, things that impacted these populations and decimated these populations. And then you had, it's funny because the US, Canada, and Australia all had these white focused immigration policies. And that's why I think it's important to, talk about the conflation of immigration and race. Because you go back to the 1920s when these theories around eugenics and scientific racism were, touting the superiority of white people and even, coming up with definitions. And this impacted immigration policies in Canada and in Australia, just like it did in the U.S., where there were, you had white Canada policies, you had a white Australia policy. In the U.S., we just called it, national origins quotas. But basically, the goal was to make the immigration flows more white and less Catholic, and so on. They didn't, the Catholics, Southern Europeans, Italians, they were also discriminated against. And, up until the 1960s, that was basically the law of the land. And then you saw the changes in Canada, Australia, and the U.S. And so this conflation of immigration and race is important to understand because our immigration policies were driven by this idea of white supremacy in terms of intelligence, in terms of, capacity, and what we wanted to be coming into our countries. Now, the U.S. had a conundrum because, of course, you already had this large Black population that you couldn't do much with it except oppress it. And so that's why you get the Jim Crow laws and so on. But, there's a strong linkage between the U.S., Canada, and Australia in terms of those immigration policies and their connection to race.
Terri, what forms of political representation do you think best allow for anti-racist policies to be enacted?
So I think if you look at, it's interesting, I've looked back at the 1960s when you saw these important, and actually in the UK it goes back to the late 1950s. And I've actually looked at this in my book, Legislating Equality. Why do you get policies that are focused on anti-racism or anti-discrimination? And a lot of it has to do with, kind of trade-offs. So you have politicians on the left who, part of it has to do with the fact that left politicians for a long time saw the potential for these diverse communities, whether they're Black or Asian or whatever they may be, as potential voters. Whereas, conservative parties, although they may bring these people into the party, they don't necessarily see them as a natural constituency. There's a whole issue of, left versus right and focus on more social programs versus, tax cuts for the wealthy, all these kinds of things that play into it. I think basically it's having, which is what, we're seeing a pushback against, is having a situation where people have the opportunity to vote for politicians who are going to improve their social welfare, who are going to vote for the kinds of policies that are going to help them build wealth and buy houses, things like that. And so that that's where there's a big divide, and that divide has only widened between left and right in recent years in terms of the kinds of policies. But I think the interesting thing to me, and we're still in the middle of it, so I can't fully process exactly how this is going to play out. But, in Europe, I've been talking since, the early 2000s about the fact that we've seen this neoliberal approach that, is for more markets. You have the rise of, the Bill Clinton and the Gerhard Schröder and Tony Blair that are, more, they're left-leaning politicians who are more market-oriented, and therefore their policies aren't necessarily going to help the bottom line of the most low-income folks in the country. But you've also seen, I think, a lot of focus on, things like housing and how do you improve the situation for people and how do you, even education. And so, obviously, if we can kind of think about policies that lift all boats. And see, this is why I think the economic argument is hard to make, because if, the problem is, and that's why Heather McGhee's book is so important, is a lot of people on the right see this as a zero-sum game. If you're gaining, I'm losing. And that's not how it works. I mean, the reality is if I'm more intelligent and I'm gaining, we have more productivity, then, all boats rise. And we have to be willing to get that word out. And, on the left, we haven't been very good, and I put myself in this camp. We haven't been very good about putting, those kinds of ideas out into the public marketplace. I think in the 60s and the 70s in the US, when you had, a strong, relatively compared to now, strong welfare state, you had strong advocates for that. And we need those strong advocates to be out there speaking for the people who are seeing their wages stagnate. And we're in a time period, because of the way the market is working, that low-income workers are seeing their wages increase because they have to increase. They've been stagnant for so long and they can't afford, the basic things. And so, I think we're going to enter a time period, hopefully, where we'll see more political power coming from those groups who are most hurt by things like huge tax breaks to the wealthy and things like that. And, left politicians will go back to their roots. We're seeing a stronger support for things like unionization. Unions, I think, are going to be really important in the future for making sure that we have policies that, are helping, working class people. So I do see some twinges of hope within what is a very bleak political landscape, but it's going to take a lot of work. And I think political science has a role to play in making sure that we put these issues front and center.
Well, we'll have to take a twinge of hope. Terri, thanks so much for joining us. If people want to read more of your work, your website is terrigivens.com and you are on Twitter at Terri Givens. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. This was fun.
Well, Andy, that's our show. We'll see you next week.
See you then.
No crime, no time. Fix Victoria's bail laws now.
Prisons are bursting at the seams with poor people. ISJA Melbourne is calling on the Victorian government to release unsentenced people on remand from Victorian prisons. First Nations people are 3% of the population, yet represent 29% of the general prison population.
89% of First Nations women entering prison are unsentenced.
ISJA Melbourne is asking you to sign the No Crime, No Time petition,
which can be found on ISJA Melbourne's Facebook page.
Indigenous Social Justice Association Melbourne is a 3CR supporter.